I would like to give like a quite top-down view on a global perspective and one way of framing it. One of the background stories here is that the IPCC decided to, for the first time, have a perspective on what they call demand side. Essentially, it's related to lifestyle changes. And the question here is what kind of climate change mitigation options are there that really involve the end user. So it's not only the consumer. I would like to shortly present like some main insights from this perspective, of course, then going into the transportation sector. But importantly, it's also about like framing a new narrative on how to evaluate mitigation options. I have to go here. Yeah, here. So I just said already, it's not only about consumers, so it's like a very important perspective. Usually there are two agents, and that's a policymaker who knows the optimal solution, and then there's the consumer who is like more or less passively and sometimes actively consuming all kind of goods and sometimes choosing perhaps some greener goods than others. But what we're saying is no, there's actually much more in that. And that's like people have also other roles. So like if you decide, for example, to live vegan, it's not only that, of course, you have like personally some impact, but it's really about also being a role model. And others who are more affluent may decide they can actually change a lot by investing, by changing their investment patterns. And that's a really important decision to make. So like there's a lot of responsibility on those who are quite wealthy to work not necessarily by buying an electric car, which may look nice and it's a nice symbol to present to their peers that they are really green, but it's really about like where they put their money in. And then there's another role, which is professionals like urban planners, transport planners, because essentially they have a lot of impact. They shape lifestyles, they shape what's possible to live. So one of the main results here is like we go into like what we call avoid, shift, improve. Avoid, shift, improve is like quite heuristic categorization of climate change mitigation policies on end use side. So this includes like building, transport, food, and also industry. So industry is surprisingly also end user because of course it requires material from somewhere else. And to just have a look at the transportation side, we have the orange bar is avoid, then we have the green one is shift, and the blue one is improve. So you see that improve is quite a lot. In buildings, it's shift is more important, especially there's a lot of potential in food. Avoid and shift is quite surprisingly large here, and that's because if we shift from a meat-based lifestyle to more vegan, not necessarily completely, but more vegan, then the impact is not only on the food sector itself, but also on the land use sector, a lot of emissions from land use. So if we shift land use pattern, it's really, really important. Okay, so the bottom line is basically, and that's very good news, like we can draw on demand side solutions, avoid, shift, improve. And by this alone, this actually mitigates by about half of emissions that we're currently having until 2050. And of course, half is not enough, we need 100%, but that makes it easier for the supply side solutions like solar PV or wind energy to actually make it possible to reach the scale needed until 2050. And this is a categorization of 60 options, 60 options on the consumption side now, like what you can change and how effective these are. So like you will see and that actually the transportation ones are dominant. For example, you can live car free or reduce the amount of flying. And these kind of options actually have a lot of potential. So this relates to other insights that while transportation is like not the, it's like about a bit of 20% of all emissions, but essentially those who are richer, who are living in the more affluent world in OECD countries, for them, and that means for us, most of us, this really means that transportation is a dominant issue of greenhouse gas emissions. not from a global perspective, but from individual perspective for those who are living in richer countries. Okay, then you can also shift. It's also important, like you can shift to public transport, to vegan diet, and there's a lot of opportunities to improve, like refurbishment, heat pumps, etc. I don't go into details here. So let's go walk through a few options. Like improve is actually important. Improve is technology, so it's more like conventional, and this involves, of course, electric vehicles. And arguably, it's a success story from climate change mitigation, because it actually looks like it's getting now much faster than previously estimated, and it goes faster because batteries cost much less. So the battery cost reduction is a success story, and it means like until 2040, a global transition to electric mobility on land transport is possible. And I know that there's a lot of questioning also on electric cars, and happy to go into details in the discussion, but just saying that this actually is supportive of climate change mitigation. Now, if you take an urban perspective, and there's a lot of information on the slide, but the bottom line is that in an urban perspective, it's not only about greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also about congestion, it's about pollution, it's about who has access to the city, and there are actually very interesting also economic effects that are quoted here as price elasticity. And what I'm saying here is, like, if you are in a city, there are more alternatives available to the car than on the countryside. Katja will probably tell us that there are also on the countryside many options, but nonetheless, it's still true that you have much easier access to all kinds of different modes inside the city. And that means economically you have a higher price elasticity, and that means, like, if you increase the cost of car transport in one way or the other, parking management, congestion charge, you just reduce the amount of parking space, etc. It's much easier to actually change to another mode. And at the same time, it's actually much better because you reduce air pollution and congestion in city in addition to climate change. Okay, so this basically the argument here is, like, cars should get out of cities. That's the bottom line, and it's not only a climate change perspective, but a more general public good perspective. Okay, so let's go to shift. Shift to shared mobility. The problem is, like, there's a misunderstanding that smart means sustainable. It's an intellectual shortcut, quite common in all parts of society, and it's simply not true. Like, smart is not sustainable. However, it can be, and the can be is basically depending on one factor, which is like the basically the amount of people per kilogram vehicle. So it's called also occupancy, but you can say, like, you can go to micromobility, so you have just 20 or 30 kilogram small vehicles, so then it's a good ratio. It depends, of course, on the lifetime of the micromobility, on e-scooters, etc. So there are other issues here, but this is a good way forward. And also it means, like, if you take a car, a shared car mobility, then you don't want to have one person inside, but you want to have 4 persons inside, or perhaps 6. So this is then a shared pooled mobility, and this gets quite greenhouse gas emission efficient, independent of technology. So that's the way forward, and that requires, like, specific political incentives and infrastructure for that, and it's not coming on its own. So this is just a scenario for Helsinki. Like, if you go for shared pooled mobility in addition to the backbone of public transport, and you ban private cars from the city, then you actually have a reduction in congestion, so you have higher accessibility. Okay, it's actually better for accessibility than before, and you have, of course, reduced greenhouse gas emission independent of electrifying transport, and you have a lot of space gained for public purposes, cafes, cycling, etc. Shift to cycling is equally effective. It's another main way forward. It's a complement to the shared pooled mobility strategy just presented, because if you do shared pooled mobility, you don't need on-street parking anymore. So you gain a lot of space and have safe bicycle lanes. And the point here is, and this is an empirical study from our institute that shows, like, that 11 kilometers of pop-up bicycle lanes increase cycling between 11 and 48% average. It's surprisingly effective to actually just provide safe cycling lanes. Last point, avoid is really like the best one, because you just avoid transport. Like, it's really about accessibility. So we want to reach like friends, shopping. We want to just hang out on the streets. Just imagine, like, perhaps an underestimated effect. If the streets in front of our doors are so nice that we can just hang out there, then we don't need to take a car to other places anymore for leisure time. And this is really about the provision of infrastructures design. It's very much also going in the same way as the shift component, but it's actually focuses on the way cities are built. So it's really about the way new cities are built, and this is the graph on the below. So these are the emissions from cities from 2010 to 2050. And the yellow one are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from existing cities, so they're going down. The blue one are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from urban structures that are just built now. And the main point is that in 2050, the induced emissions from this will be dominant. So if we design new cities or new parts of cities now in such a way that they are low carbon, this is really effective, and it can just be done by building urban structures that relate to that. And again, it's like having short ways, 50-minute cities, cycling, safe cycling infrastructures, shared food offers, access to public transit, all of that together. It's quite obvious what it is, but it's important. The gray bar actually is important. It's a side note. It's about the gray energy of the buildings. So it's a lot of emissions coming from cement and from steel, and it's very important to actually build less, and of course, like at the same time, guarantee access for everyone for shelter for affordable prices. It's a very hard challenge, but nonetheless, it's also a way to look for. Okay, so this is about, I will skip that to come to and it's not 20 slides, so it's 2 more slides, I think. So should not worry too much, but the main point is of our global analysis is that evaluating all the 18 different options in 18 different well-being categories demonstrates that doing this kind of avoid, shift, improve options actually improves the quality of life. So it's evaluated against well-being, like food quality, clean water, air quality, living a healthier life, having access to sanitation, but also to issues like personal security and participation. Like in general, the evaluated options have a positive effect on the quality of life, while at the same time reducing energy. And cities, that's this slide about cities are key to that, because it's really in urban interventions where these well-being options are realized. Okay, this is an economic argument which really says that we need to evaluate these options from economic perspective. We need a new perspective. We need to talk about endogenous preferences, because if you ask people that are living now on the suburb and they rely on a car, they say we need car mobility. But if the same people live in an inner city and have experienced how easy it is to work, to cycle, and how much better the quality of life is, then they change perspectives. But they don't do it in advance. So we're talking about endogenous, like this changing malleable preferences, and we don't have a way from welfare economic perspective to deal with that. And I see that as a main challenge for economists to come. Okay, I will leave it like that. There are some points about interaction with supply side, but I think this is like quite high level. The bottom line is demand side options have a lot of potential, and they're really good for us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Felix. If you have any questions, just put it in the chat, but of course I will place the first one if you are here. You just pointed out that it's about the wealthy people, and there's a discussion, can they buy not changing their life? How do you see this kind of point that the first, I think 1% of people are flying so many flights that it's really like a huge problem, and people are afraid of that those wealthy people can always do it like this because they have the money?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, because I think So like the first point here is aviation is the greenhouse gas emission issue with the highest inequality. And that means that essentially aviation is really important. Like, I mean, you really should tackle it, because like you should reduce emissions in several ways. These could be, of course, like having higher CO2 emission tag pricing. It could be limiting the extension of airports, or just really basically stop the extension of airports, having charges on airport usage, going to synthetic fuels actually also okay. All of that means aviation gets more expensive, and that should really happen. But I think like the wealth issue is a difficult one, because what you really want to have is impartial policies. So you don't want to have policies that tackle quotation mark only the rich, because then you have you basically blow it up politically, basically. But if you, of course, an impartial policies on aviation still means that you the rich have to pay for the continued usage of aviation.
So to maybe end it in a positive way, you pointed out that there will be a chance to have less inequality, and that we are changing the system not just for climate change, but also for people to be living in a better way. What were your studies pointing out, especially inclusion and maybe also gender sensitivity?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So like it's a bit separate from what I've presented, but there are some concluding evidence on the following points. First, there's gender inequality on climate impacts, and that is women have to suffer more, and it's mostly because women do more care jobs. So actually the more precise message is like those who are doing care jobs are more impacted by climate change. And that's, of course, mostly women, but not only. The second point is what's also clear, where women have more political power, there's more climate change policies happening. And it's also more comprehensive what's happening. So the causality is not clear to the last bit, because, of course, there are a lot of co-correlations. You usually have more women in power where the societies are more inclusive in general. Then, like from transportation perspective, of course, that's very interesting, and I think you know actually much more than myself, and I think also the next speaker. But basically, transport planning for a long time has been dominated by men from a man use perspective, and that, of course, is a big problem for sustainability and for inclusivity.
So last question is from the chat. Which of the presented measures can be pushed especially by bottom-up initiatives?
That's a very interesting question. I think like the cycling example demonstrates that this can be very well pushed. So you need organization. So it really needs to be collective. As an individual, you can't do much, but changing cities, which is also presented here, demonstrated if you combine and join forces together, you can achieve a lot. And you need actually a responsive municipality or responsive governance. So you need a political partner to talk to, otherwise no success. Shared food mobility is interesting. You may have different coalition partners. It might go even with the liberals who are like open to these kind of ideas. But of course, they think about it in different ways. So there's difficult political negotiations and framing questions that are coming up and that have not yet very much developed. So I'm very looking forward to how this is evolving next years. But I don't see much bottom-up movement happening on the shared pooled mobility side. So I don't know how this will be evolving.
Thank you so much, Felix.